Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise today also to speak on the Family Assistance Legislation Amendment building on the Childcare Package Bill 2019. I too support the amendment moved by the Shadow Minister, the member for Kingston. And of course, this bill seeks to outline a number of changes to the current childcare system to reduce some of the administrative burdens on families, including increasing the number of weeks at which enrolments automatically cease due to non-attendance and removing the 50% limit on the number of children that a provider can self-certify for additional childcare subsidy, and improving the application of third-party contributions to fees, such as state and territory payments. As we've stated on this side of the House, we support the aforementioned amendments to this bill. However, we do oppose that one amendment that could potentially have negative impacts on families who are already facing very difficult circumstances. The proposed removal of the 28-day period in which applicants have to provide personal information, including their tax file number and bank account details, could reduce access to early learning and make it much harder for vulnerable families to register for the childcare system. So we do not support this particular aspect. Indeed, we seek to protect access to early education eligibility for childcare subsidy by retaining the 28-day period for the provision of bank account and tax file numbers. Deputy Speaker, Labor has always invested in education because we believe that education is indeed the greatest move we can make in terms of the future of our children and our country. And on this side of the House, we know that quality early education leads to a range of so many better outcomes, whether it be education, social or health outcomes, and it literally does lay down the foundations for life. And it's not just Labor that's telling this story. There's widely published research that clearly states that investing in our children's early years leads to a significant return later in life. Studies have shown that children who attended preschool have significantly better reading and maths scores in primary school and better results at age 16. We also know those children who receive quality early education have higher language and cognition NAPLAN scores in Year 3. Of course, children who attend early learning have better success, are more likely to graduate from high school and have better social outcomes. The research confirms that the benefits are indeed actually higher for those vulnerable children. And that's why on this side we do, and we are very proud of our history of investing in early education. Two of the many critical policies that we implemented in government were the National Preschool Program for 4-year-olds and the National Quality Framework. The Preschools Program has been critical public policy achievement. Indeed, universal access led by the Labor government has seen enrolments of 4-year-olds in preschools increase from 77% to 93%. We back this preschool commitment with a national quality agenda in order to lift educational quality and safety standards in those early years. The Quality Framework is also a success story, with 57% of services having improved their quality rating when reassessed and 75% of services now meeting or exceeding the national quality standard. So Australia's 4-year-olds are now enjoying the benefit of universal access, and children attending early learning centres and preschools are enjoying getting so much out of the play-based learning environment and being educated by qualified early learning educators. Deputy Speaker, I, like members here, are always able to visit many of their wonderful preschools and childcare centres in their areas, and I was pleased recently to visit Gumnuts Early Learning and Preschool in Pottsville as part of the Early Learning Matters Week, and seeing firsthand the positive impacts, indeed, we feel, of our legacy and our investment in preschool and childcare. And I want to take this opportunity to applaud those early educated at Gumnuts and indeed the childcare centres right across the North Coast, many that I've visited over the years. They provide such valuable care and support to families in our community. And I'd like to recognise the important work they do in laying down the foundation for our children's future. And every day, early childhood educators across the country are carrying out extraordinarily important work of teaching and caring for our children. And it's thanks to them and families can really feel secure their children are being properly cared for, but also they're receiving a very high quality early education. Because we know that 90% of a child's brain develops in those first 5 years, so the quality learning experiences provided by the early educators can have such a positive impact on a child throughout the rest of their education and their life. And indeed, we recognise early educators as very skilled professionals, and we value the important work they do in laying down that foundation. As I said, Labor has been and will always continue to be committed to early childhood development. In contrast, though, what we do see is a very shocking record from this government, which continues to get worse when it comes to early education and early childhood development. Now, in terms of this bill and the concerns that we've raised, as we've said, it does improve some of the technical design and some of the flaws and the problems in the system. And as I said, we look forward to supporting parts of this bill that can make the system better in reducing some of those administrative burdens on providers and families. However, as I mentioned earlier, there is one aspect, one part that does raise very serious concerns, and the government argues that some of the items will simplify the system for families and providers, and those amendments require the bank account and tax file number details to be provided at the time a claim is made and not at any other time. And of course, currently parents and caregivers have 28 days after they have submitted their CCS claim to provide the details. But in fact, the government's changes will remove the 28-day time frame. And this really does raise concerns about the ability for some families to actually be able to provide this information. And it raises concerns about the impacts it may have on families who are facing difficult circumstances and just for a whole host of reasons may not have access to their personal documentation. Indeed, families and caregivers who may be experiencing domestic violence or they may be victims of a natural disaster should not just be disadvantaged, and removing the 28-day period is unreasonable, and in fact it does indeed lack compassion and not understanding the circumstances that many families may find themselves in. And the fact is some families may not be able to access urgent care they need for their children because they just don't have access to that personal information. And this aspect could also result in the debt to families when CCS payments are made without information being provided within the required time frame. Indeed, a number of submissions to the recent inquiry by the Education and Employment Legislation Committee into this bill made the point that this change will actually remove flexibility currently in the system and is designed to reduce complexity in the system for the government, but not for the family or for the providers. So the proposed changes might reduce the administrative burden for the department, but it will increase the administrative burden for families. In fact, it will make it very difficult for families to provide that information. And the reduced flexibility will also have a disproportionately negative impact on families experiencing vulnerability or disadvantage, in particular women and children escaping domestic and family violence, who, as I said, just absolutely cannot access that personal information. And removing the 28-day period and blocking families from registering for the CCS without bank account or the tax file number details immediately available will also then reduce that access to early learning that is so vitally important. So, as I say, it is first and foremost unreasonable, and it does really lack compassion for the circumstances that many vulnerable families find themselves in. And Labor doesn't believe the administrative convenience of the government should be above those needs of families and providers. Those families should come first, those children should come first and get access to that care. So we believe the bill should be amended to retain the current 28-day grace period for providing personal information to better meet the needs of families and providers. Now, in talking about the current childcare subsidy system, this government's unfair system was introduced with a multitude of problems, and months on from that introduction of this government's unfair childcare changes, the evidence just continues to mount about the negative impact that it's having across families right across the nation. According to the government's own figures, we know their childcare changes have left 1 in 4 families worse off. We know that vulnerable and at-risk families are finding it harder to access early learning. We know there are so many systemic design flaws and administrative burdens on families and burdens on providers too have become apparent. There's a very long list. Some of those include software glitches leaving families and providers in the dark, 2 out of 3 providers saying the transition's been poorly managed, educators going without pay because of problems with the system, an exodus of providers from in-home care, childcare providers being forced to act as debt collectors for Centrelink, the number of vulnerable and at-risk children accessing care dropping more than 20%. And of course, childcare fees are going up under the new system as well. They've increased a staggering 30% under this government. So there are so many problems, right from the technical glitches right through to the really concerning aspect of childcare fees going up. And indeed, we know that the system itself is essentially very confusing and it's buried in red tape for many of the providers, has a lot of problems. And families and providers have experienced significant delays, confusion and additional paperwork to register for the CCS. And this has often resulted in families' entitlements being over or underestimated, resulting in overpayments and debts for those affected families. So in addition to leaving 1 in 4 families worse off, reports have revealed that families have received payments intended for providers, leaving many parents and caregivers with huge debts. And under the government's complicated new system, when families change their details in MyGov, such as updating their income or activity, this is changing their CCS payment amount. Providers unaware of this payment change are therefore billing parents incorrectly, creating a debt. So as a result, Centrelink is then issuing a debt to the providers, expecting them to cease this from families. And there are even instances where centres are still having CCS withdrawn from their accounts by the government after accounts are closed and reconciled after families leave providers. So it really is creating such a difficult situation right across the board for both for the families and also for the providers as well. And I think especially when we look to those in the regions and when we see the cost of living going up as well, and we've got childcare costs going up as well. So when we look at the impact on the regions, it is quite extreme as well. And, you know, as I say, a 30% increase in childcare fees right across the area, right across the country, has made a major impact on families. And in my electorate of Richmond, recent data shows fees have increased over the last year to March 2019 by up to 9.5%. That's a staggering amount. This is well above the average of 4.9. So it means those families in the regions who are already doing it tough are paying significantly more out of pocket for childcare. And this, of course, is at a time when we are seeing cost of living increases, wages are stagnating, and now families are finding it really difficult under ever-increasing childcare fees. And it's an issue that they raise with me many, many times. So all of this evidence is overwhelming that the government's childcare system is indeed failing Australian families, yet they really do continue to do nothing in terms of reining in those increased childcare costs, as they should be doing, addressing all those systems. So we know those families are worse off. We know that vulnerable and at-risk children are finding it hard to access early education. And indeed, it seems that the government is just choosing to ignore a lot of that evidence and not act on it. But we call on them to act to make childcare much more affordable and much more accessible. It's so important for our children's future, and we do need to have the whole system and improve. But as I say, in terms of this bill, we support some of those measures the government introduced, but not the issue around removing that 28-day period to make sure that our vulnerable families can still get access to childcare despite the very difficult circumstances that they find themselves in.